All right, welcome back. So sometimes we want to query for only unique values, right? And in that case, we use the keyword distinct, meaning we only return distinct values from a specified column. So this is pretty useful, especially working at big tech companies. Whenever you want to count the number of users, for example, it's always good to count distinct user IDs. For example, if you have a column, and the column is user IDs, and every single user has a unique number, then you use that column to identify specific users. So the way to count the number of users, you would count distinct user IDs rather than just counting all the rows of the table. And that's because a lot of the times the data is not perfectly clean. There might be bugs, bugs from logging that logs multiple times. So there might be duplicates, like 2 rows with the same user IDs, but when you count them, you should only count them as one if ever there are duplicates. So let's look at an example here with our trusty old fast food table. Here we want to get all the distinct cities of origin that these burger restaurants are in. So for example, it's possible that there are more than one restaurant in New York City, but I don't want to return multiple rows of New York City. I just want one row, because the only thing I care about is how many cities these restaurants span. Let's look at a quick example. So imagine the table looked like this: city and name. And let's just say I omitted the type. So here we have the city origin and then also the name of the restaurants. So as you can see, there could be multiple restaurants that are from the same city. So if we executed the query that we wrote before, then what we would get is this table, because it will only return the distinct values of city origin, because the only thing I care about is which cities these restaurants are in. I do not care if multiple restaurants are in the same city. All right, so distinct is actually pretty useful, combining it with aggregations. For example, like I said before, counting distinct users, it allows us to count uniquely. So like, for example, if here we add an aggregation where we counted the distinct number of cities, it would give us 3. However, if we didn't count distinct and we just counted city origins, then we would have gotten 5, because there are 5 rows in this table. Another trick you could have done is to use distinct with multiple columns. For example, instead of just doing select distinct city origin, you could do city origin and country origin, for example, from the same thing. So what this would do, it would give us the distinct pair of city origin and country origin. So even if there's 2 cities named Venice, for example, what if this Venice is actually Italy, Venice, and this Venice is actually California, Venice, right? So I wouldn't want to count them as one. Like here, I want to count them as 2 because they're actually 2 different cities. So that's the power of distinct. This is also pretty useful in big tech companies if you want to count unique relationships. For example, if you have users and videos in your video platform, and users can watch a specific video, and you have one table that logs every time a user watches a video, then you can actually count distinct user and video to get the number of user video pair to get the unique views of videos on your platform, which is something that's pretty important. We want to understand how many videos have been seen by unique users, right? All right, so enough of the theory. Let's go to mode and look at some examples. All right, so we have many questions here that we'll try to answer using SQL. They're pretty easy. I just want to blast through them just so that we can understand how distinct works. So first, I'm pretty sure that for all these questions, we are going to use the Crunchbase investment table. So let's just select it to get a refresher on what this table looks like. Let's run this. So the first question is, how many investors are there? So investors are uniquely named, so which is easy for us. So we're just going to count the number of unique investor names. So how do we do that? Well, because we care about uniqueness, we're going to count distinct investor name. All right, and let's run this. Cool, so there's 17,000. Let's record our answer, 17,614. All right, so that's the answer. Now, how many times have investors invested in a company? Okay, so we know that this table, each row is an investment. So in this case, I don't think we should use distinct. We're just gonna count all the rows from the table. Oops, wrong table. All right, so this is how many investments have been made. Oh, 83,000 investments. Fascinating. All right. Now, if ever you get lost, you don't remember what the table looks like, you can always look at the sidebar, which tells you all of the columns. Or you can also just click here to return the first 100 rows and you run it. All right, pretty useful. So as you can see, just a little refresher what it looks like. So each row is an investment made from an investor to a company, and then it records the raised amount. All right, next question. How many unique companies did these investors invested in? All right, so this is very similar to the first question, but instead of investor name, we're going to do company name because we want to count the distinct number of companies. All right, let's see. We get 22,000. All right, 241, awesome. So next question, which company had the most investments? Raw count, not revenue. Okay, so there's one company that probably had many investments, and we don't care about the amount, but just the number of times it got invested in. All right, so do we need distinct here? Probably not, because each row is an investment. So select count. Actually, first we want the company name because we care about which company had the most investment. And then we're going to count, call this number of investments from the table dot crunchbase investments. And then we group by the company name. And then we also order by 2, which is the number of investment descending. Okay, let's try this out. Could always add a space here. Oh, we forgot the word by here. Order by 2. All right, seems like fab.com had 59 investments, which is the top. Fascinating. All right, which company had the most investors? Is that different from the question previously? So it's very possible that an investor invested multiple times in a company. You know, maybe they invested during Series A and also Series B and also Series C, stuff like that. So let's check it out. Which company had the most investors? All right, how do we do that? So first of all, we care about the company. So we have the company name here to group by. And then where are we going to count? We're going to count the unique investors. So how do we do that? We're going to count distinct investor name. Investor name, right? From the table. And then we're going to do the same thing. Group by 1, order by 2, descending. So this time we're going to see which company had the most investors. Aha, so it's not fab.com anymore. So it's very possible that fab.com is 33. So 33 investors made, how many was it? 66 investments. So as you can see, this company, the investors like to invest in it multiple times. But EcoMom, they had 49 different investors invested in them. Fascinating. All right, cool. Now, the other question, which is kind of similar to what we talked about, how many company investor pair relationships are there? So how do we do that? So this is actually a trick question because you'll see that the syntax is a little bit off. But first, I'll do it in a way that you think it would be done. So what we care about the count, and then we care about distinct what? Distinct company name, and investor name, right? The reason why we want to do that is because we care about the unique pairs of company name and investor name. So one investor can invest in multiple companies, and that would be counted rather than just counted as one if we just count distinct investors. All right, and then from the same table, and then that should work, right? Unfortunately, it does not work because count cannot have an argument where there's multiple columns. So what we can do is I'm going to teach you something called a subquery, which is each SQL query returns a table. So what if you can actually query from that table itself, right? So what if I can do select star from, and then the table is actually this subquery. What if I did this? Distinct investor name. So here it's kind of redundant. So I'm going to select distinct company name and investor name from this table. And then I'm going to select everything from this subtable. But I'm just going to do it just to show you. Oops, I have to name it something. Let's just call it table 1. Select. As you can see, now we have the company name and investor pairs. Perfect. So now what do we want to do? We want to count them. So now we could just count star because we know that the underlying table, which is what we did here, is unique company investor pairs. All right. Now this formatting is pretty terrible. So usually what you want to do is you want to have the subquery to be in another indentation like this. All right, cool. So if ever you want to use format SQL and you have multiple SQL queries, make sure you put a semicolon right after each query. All right. So I'm just going to do that and I'm going to click format query. All right. So this is, I guess, a little bit more readable. Okay, last question. Which company investor pair had the most investments made? All right. So this should be easy. It's kind of like the easier version of this. Instead of counting the unique pairs of company investors, we are just counting the rows because each row is an investment. So we're just going to select the company name and then investor name, and then we're just going to count it. Okay, from tutorial Crunchbase. And then group by the 2 columns, and then order by the 3rd column, which is the count, and then we're gonna count descending. All right, let's run this. Oh, I see. So it seems like Oxford Capital Partners, they invested in Rostima 12 times. That's crazy. I wonder why they wouldn't just invest a bigger sum of amount. But anyways, that's not for me to question. So yeah, so that's pretty much it for distinct. I added some questions where you don't have to use distinct and some questions where you do, just so that you can understand the difference between counting all the rows and counting distinct a specific column. All right, so that's pretty much for distinct, and I'll see you in the next one.